Right. Good afternoon, everyone. So happy and grateful to be with us. This afternoon, the title of the presentation is Consciousness and Immortality, and that will be given to us by our own Pablo Sender.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's a joy to be here with you and to be able to share some thoughts about this very interesting and actually practical subject. So let me share the PowerPoint. We are going to look into some quotes and then toward the end of the presentation, we will work a little with some practical approaches to help us realize what we are going to explore in the first part of the talk. So the question of whether we are immortal or not is something that is asked in many fields. In general, in religions, there is an assumption that we are immortal in one way or the other. Most scientific views deny the possibility of immortality because evidently the body cannot live forever. But even in the theosophical tradition, if we ask, are we immortal? The answer is not as straightforward as one may think. What we need to know first is, what do we mean by we when we ask, are we immortal? In the theosophical tradition, there is a quite complex study of the human constitution, and this is very necessary if we want to understand these deep subjects. Now, I'm not going to go into too many details because I assume that there may be people watching us that are not necessarily all that familiar with theosophy. But let me briefly show you one way in which the human being is portrayed in these teachings. So we evidently, an aspect of ourselves is our body, our physical body, which we are all familiar with. We can perceive it through our five senses. But of course, we are not just a body. There is also what we may call a psyche. By psyche, I mean the mind, emotions, and all the psychological aspects. But also there is something higher than that psyche, which is what we call the soul. The soul, as we are going to see, is something that is more transcendental than our mind and emotions. And finally, there is what we may call the spirit, which is even more transcendental than the soul. The theosophical literature looks at human beings in a more detailed way, as I said, but this is good enough for our purposes. So the question is, when we are asking whether we are immortal or not, to what aspect of a human being are we referring to? Because, for example, if we think of a human being as a body and we try to look at the question of immortality in terms of a body, it is evident that we cannot be immortal. In fact, from a philosophical point of view, structures that are made of matter that come together to create a form cannot be held forever in that form, so they are bound to dissolve. Now, when we talk about immortality from an esoteric point of view, this is not what we mean. From an esoteric point of view, we are not talking about an everlasting body. So, for example, one of Blavatsky's teachers, the Mahatma K.H. or Kutumi, wrote, "The word immortality has for the initiates and occultists quite a different meaning than what most of humanity think when talking about this." And how is it that the esoteric philosophy defines immortality? Well, to begin with, it looks at the consciousness aspect of the question, not so much at the body or matter aspect of a human being. So, continuing with Mahatma K.H., he said, complete or true immortality, which means an unlimited sentient existence, can have no break and stoppages, no arrest of self consciousness. So here you see that he talks about self consciousness, about sentient existence. So evidently, he's talking about the subjective experience of being aware, of being conscious of myself as an individual. That's what self consciousness means. In another quote, he says, immortal, then, is he whose distinct consciousness and perception of self, under whatever form, undergoes no disjunction at any time, not for 1 second during the period of his egoship. So he's saying here, immortal is the person whose distinct consciousness and self-perception continues under whatever form. This is important because the physical body dies, but as we saw, there are other higher principles in a human being. So it is possible that the physical body dies, and yet we retain our conscious sense of being on other forms, on other structures, which we may call the psyche, the soul, etc. Now he says, a person that is immortal, that means that that sense of self, the continuity of the sense of self, does not cease even for a second during the period of egoship. Now, this word ego, that in theosophy, sometimes when we are referring to a higher aspect of our egoity, we pronounce it as in the Greek word ego. This word comes from the Greek and simply means I-ness. When early theosophical literature was being developed, this was before modern psychology came to the scene with Freud and Jung, etc. And so the word ego which today for most people, the word ego means something that from a spiritual point of view has to be transcended, etc. The word ego in theosophical literature has a far broader meaning. There is the personal ego. Remember, ego means I-ness. So there is a personal sense of I-ness, which is the one that in the spiritual path one seeks to transcend. But there is a higher sense of I-ness, a pure sense of I-ness, or a spiritual sense of I-ness. And that's what we call the higher ego or the spiritual ego, etc. So what Mahatma K.H. is saying here is that immortal is that person who retains a sense of I-ness continuously, and that sense of I-ness is not lost or arrested, even momentarily. You know, from this point of view, our immortality lasts for a day because we go to sleep and then we lose an awareness of our own sense of I-ness. So in most of us, our sense of self continues, let's say, throughout the day. But there is the possibility of, by means of inner development, retaining that sense of being beyond the body awakening and going to sleep, and beyond death, and it can even be beyond the formation and destruction of our own planet, as we are going to see. So from this point of view, are we immortal, and to what degree are we immortal? And there is an article by Eliphas Levi that was published in an early Theosophist, the journal that Blavatsky was the editor of, where that article says the souls of those who have not believed in immortality will not become immortal. It is faith only which gives personal immortality. Now, Blavatsky said similar things. She would say that after death, if a person didn't believe the possibility of being aware after the body dies, then that person would not be aware after death. Of course, this has to be the case of an extreme case of materialism. It's not just a belief as an intellectual belief that most intellectual beliefs, one way or the other, are quite superficial, but a real conviction and a long life of limiting ourselves only to what the senses can bring would produce that once we are as consciousness, we are without a physical body and without senses, we have not developed the ability to have any perception, and therefore we, personally speaking, here Eliphas Levi says personal immortality. So I, as Pablo, let's say, would not have any consciousness after death. So Master KH comments on this because some theosophists complained, how come that Eliphas Levi is saying this and that you published it in the Theosophist if we are talking about our spiritual nature as being eternal? So, our spiritual nature is eternal whether we believe in life after death or not, etc. And Master KH says, of course, the monad, this is another term for our higher principles. The monad never perishes, whatever happens. But Eliphas speaks of the personal, not of the spiritual egos. So in this article, Eliphas Levi talks about the personal I-ness or the personal ego, whether the personal ego survives after death or not, and not about the spiritual I-ness that is part of our higher principles. So we will see this in more detail soon. So here we have a first point that is important. There are some principles in us that are already eternal. The monad, the spiritual ego, etc. They are eternal in a relative sense. When Blavatsky wrote about eternity, she always said that eternity is relative, that eternity in esoteric philosophy does not mean forever and ever, that the word eternity comes from the Greek aeon, and aeon is a particular cycle of time. So we have some principles that are eternal in the sense that they last for as long as that particular cycle of time lasts. Then when that cycle is over, that principle which lasted throughout the whole cycle may perish. So what Mahatma KH is saying here, sure, our higher principles are relatively eternal, but that is not the point here. The point is whether our personal consciousness can become eternal or not, can extend beyond the duration of the body or beyond the duration of a multiplicity of bodies in the cycle of reincarnation, or even longer cycles or not. So just to show that this is what, when we discuss the question of immortality, this is normally the focus, whether the personal consciousness is immortal or not. Blavatsky says personal immortality is conditional. This means there is the possibility of attaining some level of immortality of our personal consciousness. It is not a given, and it is not impossible. It depends on an inner process that we are going to explore briefly. So let us look again to the human constitution. We said that we have a body through which we have all these perceptions, and we are aware of the body. So as long as the body lasts, with those breaks when we go to sleep, but leaving that aside, as long as the body lasts, for the most part, we retain a sense of being the same person. Our bodies are constantly changing, our sensations are constantly changing. In my body right now, as in yours, there is not a single atom that was part of the body of the baby that was born that they called Pablo. And yet, since I gained self-awareness, up to this day, I feel I'm the same person, despite the fact that nothing in me materially is the same. So far, personally speaking, we last throughout our lives, unless there is some problem with our brains and we lose our self-awareness. Now, what happens when the body dies? Well, there is this principle that we are calling the psyche, which is the seat of our memories, our thoughts, our sensations. And we are also self-aware at this level. I'm aware of my emotions, I'm aware of my thoughts, of my memories. My sense of being Pablo extends to the psyche in the same way as it happens in all of you. So when the body dies, unless we have been very materialistic, as Blavatsky mentioned, which is more of an exception, we remain aware of our own personal consciousness to some degree. It can be more or less clear, that awareness, but we remain aware because we continue our consciousness in this, let's call it, psychic body. Again, I'm trying to simplify the theosophical constitution of human beings because we don't need to go into details to get the main ideas here. Now, what happens, well, we can say that this is what we call I am. Blavatsky in the Key to Theosophy used the example, I am Mr. Smith. The personal consciousness encompasses all of this. So my sense I am Pablo encompasses my memories, thoughts, sensations, emotions, etc. Now, what happens when all of that is gone after death? Are we gone to? In the theosophical view, there is this higher principle that is the soul. Again, there are different levels in the soul. Let us take it as a unit. What we may call the spiritual ego, the spiritual sense of I-ness. Now, the sense of I-ness, the sense of individuality, as it is called in theosophical literature, of the soul, is not the same sense of individuality as the personality. The personality, my body and psyche, are based on this particular body with this particular set of memory and emotions and sensations. The soul is beyond this. So the soul doesn't feel, I am Pablo. The soul, which is our true nature, we are talking in the third person as if the soul is something other than us, simply because we are analyzing this. But this is the source of our true sense of I-ness. Now, when we leave behind body and psyche after death, we come to a realization of our spiritual identity, and we realize that we are far more than the personality. We have had many experiences in the past through other personalities, other bodies in other countries and cultures and languages, etc. And in each of those personalities, we felt that we were that particular person, perhaps a Chinese woman, and we felt, I am this Chinese woman. And in the future, we may be born somewhere else in Africa, and we may feel, I am this African person. But the soul is beyond all of this. The soul is aware of being a spiritual entity. So at the level of the soul, in normal people, in people who have not gotten to a deep level of self-realization, at the level of the soul, the personality is gone. The personality, the personal sense of being in non-initiates, let's say, finishes at the end of the post-mortem processes. Now, beyond the soul, there is an even higher seat of consciousness, what in theosophical literature sometimes we call Atman, the self. And that self is beyond even the sense of I-ness, of egoity. While the spiritual ego is immortal within a particular cycle, that spiritual ego can also come to an end. Atman is far more eternal, far more immortal than the spiritual ego. But eventually, after some cycle of manifestation is over, it can also be reabsorbed back in its source, in the absolute reality, and the sense of being that self, whatever kind of sense that is, because Blavatsky says very clearly that there is no sense of I-ness as we understand it there. But whatever that sense of self is at the level of Atman can also come to an end at the end of a huge cycle. So we have all these different potential immortalities which depend on us extending our sense of personal being into higher and higher principles. So, for example, this is an explanation that Mahatma K.H. gave. He says, let us say that I begin my immortality at the present fourth round. For those not familiar with this, the idea is that there are 7 rounds of evolution on this earth and other spheres connected to this earth. Huge rounds of evolutions implying millions of years. And there are 7 of them. At this point, we are in the 4th round of evolution. So the master is saying here, suppose that I am able to identify myself fully with the higher nature, so that I become immortal for the totality of this round. This is what he's going to say. So let us say I begin my immortality at the present 4th round, that is, having become a full adept, which unhappily I am not. I arrest the hand of death at will, and when finally obliged to submit to it, my knowledge of the secrets of nature puts me in a position to retain my consciousness and distinct perception of self as an object to my own reflective consciousness and cognition. So let me explain a little what he's saying here. As a person becomes what we call an initiate, then there is the possibility of learning to extend the duration of the physical body for several centuries. Blavatsky says about 400 years. And so an adept is able to extend the duration of the body for, let's say, 400 years. And for all those years, of course, there is a continuity of personal consciousness. But nobody, as we said, can be immortal because the body is material. So this is why he says, I arrest the hand of death at will during those 400 years, let's say. And when finally obliged to submit to death, then the knowledge of the secrets of nature puts the adept in a position to, when the body dies, retain the personal consciousness, which means, he says, and thus avoiding all such dismemberments of principles that as a rule take place after the physical death of average humanity. So when we die, the physical body dies, then the psyche dies, then there is an experience at the level of the soul, and then we come back to another personality. And that's part of the dismemberment of principles that the master is talking about here, that we all go through. But an adept knows how to avoid that normal process where death basically begins to separate the different personal principles of a human being and dissolve them. The adept knows how to avoid that, and therefore can retain full personal consciousness because all these principles remain there. So he continues, I remain as Kutumi in my ego throughout the whole series of births and lives across the 7 worlds or planes and Arupa lokas. Arupa means formless. So there is a whole range of planes of consciousness that we eventually go through. And so he says, I remain as Kutumi throughout the whole series of birth and lives across all the 7 worlds and the Arupa lokas, until finally I land again on this earth among the let's say the 5th round, in the next round of evolution, and the adept is born again on this earth in the next big cycle of evolution as Kutumi, without having lost that personal consciousness. Of course, in our own case, as we said, our personal consciousness is gone even after a single life, because the next incarnation will be, I don't know, let's say Mary, my next incarnation, Mary born somewhere else, and I will have no consciousness of what Pablo was. Well, in the case of a full adept, he's able to go through the process of evolution for millions of years on different planes and different globes, always retaining that personal consciousness. So he continues, I would have been, in such a case, immortal for an inconceivable, to you, this is something he was writing to an early theosophist, I would remain immortal for an inconceivable long period, embracing many milliards of years. So you see here, the master is talking about the possibility of extending that personal consciousness for millions of years. Now, there is a work to be done. He says, he continues in this letter where he's talking about this, that unless he continues to work at inner growth and development, then he won't be able to do that. And then he will be brought back into, in the next round of evolution, brought back into a new personality with a new identity, having forgotten his identity as Kutumi, for example. So what is happening here? Back to the human constitution, we saw there is the body, there is the psyche, and there is the soul. And in the case of a full adept, the sense of I am, in this case, I am Kutumi, has been extended to the spiritual ego. He's aware, while incarnating, that he is the spiritual ego, and therefore the consciousness as the spiritual ego is part of the personality. And for that reason, the personal consciousness becomes immortal. So if we were able, so in the same way that because we are aware of our thoughts and emotions, we can be aware, we can remain conscious after the physical body is dead, in our psychic body, because we were aware of our psychic nature. If we were aware of our nature as a soul, after the psyche is gone, we would still remain personally aware, because that awareness of the soul would have been integrated in our personality. Of course, there is a higher also level of immortality that the adepts continue to develop. That is the immortality at the level of Atman. And this goes far beyond the possibilities of immortality at the level of the soul. So this gives us some sense of the different levels of immortality that gradually in our spiritual development we can reach. But there are far deeper levels even than this. So, for example, in a writing by T. Subbarao, who was an early theosophist, he was a disciple of the same teacher as Blavatsky, and actually Blavatsky said that Suvarov was her equal in occultism. So he says, he's writing, and he said, we have said that the logos is related to the Atma. Logos is a term in theosophy that represents the universal mind, the source of life and consciousness and matter, at least the differentiated matter in our solar system. So the logos is related to the Atma, to our ultimate self on each of the planes. It is, however, useless to attempt to understand the relationship between the Atma, our real self, on any plane and the logos. For us, we can't understand that. However, this relation, he says, must be known after the last initiation, where man will thoroughly understand his spiritual nature. So this is what I was mentioning, that the adepts continue to strive for, to realize their identity as this spiritual, ultimate spiritual self. And then at that point, they can understand their relation to the logos. Of course, when we say understand, we are not talking about intellectual understanding. We are talking about an inner realization of these realities. So he continues, after the last initiation, the adept thoroughly comprehends the relation of Atma with the Logos and the method of merging himself in the Logos. So you see, in the same way that we were talking about trying to integrate in our personal consciousness the higher principles, this is a process that continues and that can include the Atman and can include even the Logos. So let me read that. And the method of merging himself in the Logos by which he obtains immortality. So as long as we are evolving in this solar system, the highest immortality that can be attained implies our identification with the Logos, that is the source of the system. So that would be true immortality. Although in that letter that I was mentioning, the master says that immortality in absolute terms is only one. It's only that absolute immortality that implies the ability to retain our awareness when we merge with the absolute reality. And that's an inconceivably high attainment. So other than that, all the rest of immortalities are relative, but they can last for an inconceivably long period, as the master was saying. So by which he obtains immortality, but it may take him several incarnations after the last initiation before he can merge in the Logos. This is all really hard work of spiritualizing our consciousness that even to a full adept can take a long time. And then he concludes this part of his writing. He talks about the 7 rays which proceed from the Logos. This is something that Subarao and Blavatsky talked about. When the Logos manifests, it manifests through 7 rays of consciousness. Sometimes Blavatsky would call them the 7 primordial beings, celestial beings. And through each of them, the individual monads emerge through each of these rays. So he says, the 7 rays proceed from the Logos. Up to the individual's ray, each of us have emanated through one of these rays, one or the other. So up to the individual ray, he must make his further progress till he has succeeded in merging his life in the life of the Logos. So here he's giving us another clue. How does the adept merge with the Logos? Is through the ray that his monad or her monad belongs to. through the ray that the monad emanated. And by going through that ray, eventually the adept can merge with the consciousness of the logos. The great fountainhead of light and power. When this mergence takes place, the man does not suffer loss of individuality. And because there is this idea in Buddhism, this is something that Blavatsky argued against, the idea that in general in Buddhism, the concept of nirvana, which if we do a comparative study, it would correlate to the realization of Atman, not the realization of the Logos. The realization of the Logos is beyond what Buddhists call nirvana, at least from a theosophical point of view. But even the realization of Atman, what Buddhists call nirvana, is often talked as the annihilation of consciousness. Now, Blavatsky would say that this is a misunderstanding. It is an annihilation of consciousness, but it's the annihilation of an I-centered consciousness. Atman, as I said, is the self. There is some kind of consciousness there, but it's not a consciousness in any way that we can know or imagine. Technically speaking, consciousness is dualistic. I am conscious of something else. The nirvana, or the world of Atman, is the unity, is unitive. So there cannot be separation, therefore there cannot be consciousness. And for this reason, Blavatsky herself would use sometimes the word unconsciousness to refer to Atman. But then she would explain, it's not unconsciousness in the way that we understand it. Atman is neither conscious nor unconscious. And she coined a term. She would say sometimes Atman is conscious non-consciousness. So it's non-consciousness, but it's conscious. You see, this is obviously a paradox, but paradoxes are inevitable when we are talking about a quality that doesn't belong to our field of experience at all. But anyway, considering Atman as non-consciousness, many Buddhist practitioners think that nirvana is simply annihilation. And Blavatsky, as I said, was saying it is annihilation of this kind of consciousness, but there is an existence there which we cannot understand. And this is what Subbarao is saying here. So the man does not suffer loss of individuality, rather, he enjoys an almost infinite extension of individuality. Now the adept becomes the logos. Now the adept is the totality at least within the boundaries of our system. So you see, this is important because the idea of immortality is precisely that, is that in the process of evolution, what is being created is a sense of individuality that can be progressively extended, made more spiritual, progressively spiritualized, and progressively universalized until we get to a sense of individuality that excludes nothing and that contains the totality. And that would be the achievement of the ultimate immortality within the confines of our solar system. So just to give this in a more graphical form, we have the logos, we have the 7 rays that emanate from the logos, and then we have our Atman that emanates through one of those 7 rays. Then the Atman expresses itself on lower planes through an individual soul, and that soul, when it incarnates, expresses itself through a personality, a psychophysical personality with a body and a mind. So the movement of immortality implies reversing this process of emanation. So from the personality, we need to extend our sense of I-ness to the soul, and then to the Atman, and then to the head of the wraith, this primordial celestial being through which we emanated, and eventually to the Logos. So we are reversing the process of emanation, merging with higher and higher individualities. So evidently, the first step that we as seekers need to accomplish is the realization of our true nature as a spiritual individuality, as a soul, to transition from the sense of I am Pablo or I am your particular personality to a full awareness of you as the reincarnating soul that has had experiences through many lifetimes and will have experiences in future lifetimes. So, how can this be done? Well, the whole spiritual life has this aim, but I want to point to perhaps a particular practice that is helpful in this endeavor. So what we are seeking is to try to identify ourselves with the higher ego, the reincarnating ego, the soul. These are synonyms that Blavatsky uses. Now let's see. Judge said there is but one universal mind, which is the Logos. It is differentiated in human beings of the average order and more or less vitiated by desire. So our own mind is an emanation of the universal mind. The universal mind is the mind aspect of the Logos, let's say. So in all of us is the potential to realize the universal mind, but in us, that universal mind is kind of fragmented and identified with the desires, the personal desires, and the body, etc. Now he continues, when man broadens to the universal, his higher mind, which is the mind at the level of the soul, in its original purity, is a state of being and not an organ. So he's talking about here, as we spiritualize or universalize our nature, we need to realize the higher mind not as a body or as a particular organ, as he says, spiritual organ, let's say, but as a state of being. Our personal ego is a state of being. It's the state of I am Pablo. The I amness, which is associated with Pablo, meaning body, emotions, memory, thoughts, etc. Now we need to realize our higher mind as a state of being in which there is no identification with any personal element, because the personal elements, my particular thoughts, my particular emotions, my particular body and sensations, they all belong to the personality. So the state of being at the higher mind is a pure sense of I amness. There is a sense of I-ness there. That's why it is called higher ego. But it's a pure sense of I-ness, a pure sense of I am, I exist, without limitations, without separations. If I say I am, if I'm in a state where there is only awareness of being, my awareness of being is the same of you at that level. When I say I am these particular thoughts, then my thoughts are different from yours. When I say I am this particular body, then my body is different from yours. So that I-ness is embedded in a sense of separation. But suppose that you are in a deep state of silence, where there are no sensations that belong to your personality. There are no emotions that belong to your personality. There are no thoughts or memories that belong to your personality. What are you when you are in a deep, complete silence? You are not any of your personal marks. You have no personal marks, so to say. The personal elements, as we said, have been left behind. That's the experience. Your experience of a state of profound silence is the same as my experience of being in profound silence. In that profound silence, you will find that the only thing that is there is a sense of being, a quiet and unspoken, unthought sense of being. And that silent sense of being, of pure I amness, is the same in you and me. So this is a more universal sense of being, of I-ness, which is available in the higher mind. That's the state of being that Judge is talking about. So how can we work to perceive that? Well, I just said it. Judge says, in order to realize this, it is necessary to withdraw our consciousness gradually and persistently from the illusion of the senses to the ecstasy of inward vision. That is, to gradually elevate the plane of consciousness. So we need to engage in a meditative practice in which we withdraw our sense of being, of I-ness, and we purify it. When I say, I am happy, I am angry, I am hopeful, I am sad, I am this, I am that, I am identifying with happy, angry, sad, etc. But none of that is me. Those are temporary states that are presented to me. The I am is the same behind all of these. I am hungry, let's say. The I am is there. Hunger is a temporary state. I am happy, then the I am is the same. Happy is a temporary state. So we need to purify our sense of being and realize what Blavatsky says in the Key to Theosophy, for example, I am I, not I am Pablo. I am I just am. I just exist without any limitation, without any identification. For that, we need to withdraw, as Judge is saying here, our consciousness from the senses and the sensations, from the emotions, from the thoughts, and learn to dwell in silence, where we can start realizing our being as the higher ego, our individuality as the higher ego. Now, Blavatsky gave us an exercise for this, which is what we call the diagram of meditation. The story of this diagram of meditation, we get it from E.T. Sturdy. He was an early member who was part of an inner group that Blavatsky had formed to teach more personally her closest pupils. And Sturdy said that Blavatsky gave him this diagram of meditation. Before he died, he sent the diagram of meditation to Christmas Humphreys. And then eventually Christmas Humphreys published this diagram of meditation. So it is very interesting. If you look it up online, you will see the diagram as it was published in a magazine that Humphreys was the editor. But basically, the diagram begins by saying, first, conceive of unity by expansion in space and infinite in time. So the first exercise right away is to try to universalize our sense of being, our consciousness. And we can spend months and years working on this, because this is a very deep exercise, as simple as it may seem when we read it. But then she said, after you get some sense of universality, of eternity, meditate logically and consistently on this in reference to the states of consciousness. We don't know what Blavatsky meant precisely, because unfortunately Sturdy just gave the diagram and never elaborated on it. But she says, meditate on the fact that you are infinite in connection, in reference to your states of consciousness. So one way that we can work on this is by realizing basically what I was saying before. if I am eternal, all states of consciousness that I experience, which are transitory, are not me, are not myself. In other words, you, the eternal, can witness the passing states of consciousness, which means that you are none of the states of consciousness that you perceive. You are always beyond, because otherwise you would not be eternal. You in your ultimate nature. Of course, our personal consciousness, as long as our personal consciousness is identified with all these passing transitory states, that's why our immortality lasts for very little, because we are identified with passing things. But in this exercise, we are trying to extend that personal sense of I-ness to the eternal. And in this attitude, let's say, we need to realize that nothing that you perceive is yourself, because anything you perceive is a temporary state of consciousness. You are always the witness of the state of consciousness. You are always behind. And then she gives, this is just a preliminary, although very deep and can be your whole meditation, as I said, for years. But this is a preliminary foundation for a very interesting exercise that she gives next, which is an effort to realize some of the qualities of us as the higher ego, some of our own qualities, not as the personality, but as the higher ego. So she gives what she calls acquisition, a series of acquisitions, things that we need to acquire to incorporate in our personal consciousness, and some deprivations, things that we need to deprive ourselves from or get rid of in our personal consciousness, so that we can actuate this universalization of our personal consciousness. So I'm going to show the acquisitions and deprivations side by side, because I think that she is contrasting the quality of our consciousness as the higher ego versus the quality of our personal consciousness in these different acquisitions and deprivations. So she says, after this preliminary exercise, the normal states of our consciousness must be molded by the following acquisitions. And then she says that we should add a constant refusal to think of the reality of the following deprivations. Now you see that she says our normal state of consciousness. So this is not something that should be done only in meditation. In our daily life, we need to make an effort to come from that state of consciousness, which, as we are going to see, is very difficult, but not impossible. And if we spend time meditating on this, meditation is we create in meditation an artificial environment and situation where we shut off the external world so that we can try to perceive, to realize to some extent, these states of consciousness within ourselves. And once we have a glimpse of it in meditation, then we can try to retain it and to bring it with us in our daily life. So I would say, if you want to practice this, start working on this in meditation and then make an effort to bring it to your daily life. At the beginning, bring it in special moments in your day, because unless you have been doing this for many, many incarnations, you probably won't be able to retain this throughout the day. But at some points, you can say, I'm going to, for example, when I'm going for a walk, or I'm doing this or that, I'm going to try to act from this point of view. So the first acquisition and the first deprivation that she talks about is the acquisition. Let me read from the beginning. The normal state of our consciousness must be molded by a perpetual presence in imagination in all space and time. Because in our spiritual nature, we are not limited by space and time as we are in our personality. So one of the problems, let me do here a parenthesis. One of the problems that we have is that we are so used to being limited by the personality that we develop this habit and we don't know how to break it. So we need to develop and to start feeding, nourishing a different perception that will overcome the habit of being limited to the personality. And this is what the diagram of meditation is trying to do. So you try to put yourself with the inner sense of being in all space and time. At the same time, apply a constant refusal to think of the reality of separations and meetings, association with places, times, and forms, because all that belongs to the personality. I'm Argentinian, or I'm American, or I am close to my family, I am away from my family. All that has to do with the body that is here and not there, with the mind that was shaped in this country or in that country. But this is an illusion because we are not this. We are in all space and time. So this is a couple of acquisitions and deprivations that you can start practicing in your life. Refuse to think that you are limited by the body, and bring to your consciousness repeatedly that you are in all space and time. Then, second acquisition and the second deprivation. Another point that we can bring into our practice. So again, the normal state of our consciousness must be molded by a continued attempt at an attitude of mind to all existing things, which is neither love, hate, nor indifference. Love and hate here in a lower sense, like likes and dislikes, not the universal love. So she's saying, try to mold your consciousness with a continued attempt in your relationship with all things that is not conditioned by like, dislike, and is not indifference. Because it would be easy, okay, don't be caught in likes and dislikes, then you can withdraw and be indifferent to things. But she's saying, no, indifference is not the answer. If you relate to something without being led by likes or dislikes, and without being indifferent, what is left there? Being present, relating to the person, the thing that you are doing, whatever it is, being there. You cannot be indifferent, but you relate to that from a place of equanimity. Now she says, of course, one must be different in external activity to each person or object, or because in each the capacity alters, is different, but mentally the same to all. So this is not a plight to be completely useless in the world because everything is one and therefore we have no discernment. Or we externally we need to recognize the differences, but mentally we are the same to all because we are relating from the point of view of the unity. And coupled with this is a constant refusal to think of the reality of the distinction of friend and foe. This is quite obvious. I mean, we call friends those that we like, that do things that we enjoy, and we call foes those that we don't like or do things that we don't enjoy. If we relate to everybody with equanimity, then we are not conditioned by our idea, this is my friend, this is my foe. And the last one, the normal state of our consciousness must be molded by the perception in all embodied beings of limitation only. So realize that as long as you are relating to anything in the field of the lower planes, that thing or that person is just a limitation. We may not agree with how a person is acting, but that is because the personality is limited. The soul of the person is sacred, is a spiritual being that is one with you. And so you don't let yourself be dragged into disliking a person or judging a person by the limitation of the personality. And then there are three deprivations that I think are connected to this acquisition, which is the constant refusal to think of the reality of possessions. Obviously, possessions are connected to our limited physical body and personality. The personality, which we said is limited, and sensations, which also belong to our limited nature. So in this case, you try to realize that everything that you relate to on the lower planes is limited, and therefore you should not let yourself be conditioned by that. And she finishes the diagram with a couple of notes. Acquisition is complete with the conception, I am all space and time. And beyond that, there is something beyond that, but that cannot be expressed, that is ineffable. And so the idea is this is kind of an affirmation that you can keep with you throughout the three acquisitions. And then there is another note for the deprivations. These deprivations are produced by the perpetual imagination and meditation without self-delusion of I am without attributes. So the idea, attributes are limitations. You are without attributes. And she continues, the recognition of those attributes being the source of bondage, ignorance, and strife. So we have here a practical way to begin that transition from, or that extension of our personal consciousness from the personality to the higher ego, which is our first goal in this long journey toward immortality. Thank you. I don't know if you have a session of comments and question and answers. I'll leave it up to you.
Yes, hello. This is Ken Campos here in the blood. Thank you, Pablo, for that wonderful exposition and explanation of states of consciousness, and then getting deeper into that, what we might then do about it to help move ourselves and our sense of identity to higher levels. So I'll moderate some Q&A here, and I'll start with one question from one popular philosopher I've heard of, our identity as gross, subtle, and causal. And would you say that in this other vocabulary, that causal is that sense of identity you were speaking of, in which in that meditational practice, one sees themselves as existing throughout all space and time?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Blavatsky, when talking about the higher ego, she, in the Kichu Theosophy, for example, she talked about the Karana Sharira as being the body of this ego. And Karana means causal. So, and she used the word causal body for the higher ego on a few occasions. So the causal consciousness from this point of view would be the consciousness of the higher ego. Now, for us, that's at this point, that is the highest that we can aspire to. And for us, that's the presence in all space and time. Now, what happens is that once we realize our nature as the higher ego, then we realize that there is an even deeper nature in us that is even more truly present in all space and time, that is the monad. And again, once that is realized, if we follow that chain of emanations that Subarao was talking about, and that Blavatsky mentions, she mentions that the monad has to be able to merge itself with the head of the ray. So these concepts of being in all space and time, they again are relative. What appears to us as being infinite, once we realize it, we realize that there is a deeper infinity, and that goes, all the way to the logos and beyond. But yes, for the time being, that causal consciousness would be what we are aiming at.
Well, thank you, thank you. And the corollary of that is perhaps the analogy, which might be valid or invalid, that at that higher level of identity awareness, one could maintain a sense of identity as a drop of water, but yet you're merged with the ocean. But even though you're in the ocean, like Kutumi, thinking he could be an adept from a master, is still aware of his identity as a drop of water.
Yeah, yeah, that's a famous Buddhist image, and the way that theosophists have applied that to our subject is that when the drop of water merges in the ocean, it does not disappear, it becomes the ocean. So the consciousness that was within the drop of water as a limited drop of water, now emerging with the ocean, becomes a consciousness of being the totality of the water, the totality of the ocean.
Well, thank you, thank you. Well, let's go to some of our audience in the Zoom part of the world. Let's start with Judy, Dr. Judy from San Luis Obispo.
Yes, thank you very much for an amazing lecture, Pablo. I just wanted to ask about the quotation. Is it Kutume who says, a full adept, which unhappily I am not?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know even H.P. Blavatsky in the Secret Doctrine Dialogue says, I'm not a high adept. I mean, she's just a riot in the Secret Doctrine Dialogues, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
So what could it mean? These beings are so much higher than we are, but yet there's a saying, I'm always a higher Buddha.
Yeah.
Even if a being has a Nirmanakaya body, they're still evolving.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what is meant by this?
I suppose so. He says that in the Mahatma Letter 70C in the chronological edition. I'm not sure what the correlation is with the Barker edition right now, but in the chronological edition is the letter 70-C. And Blavatsky mentions that there are 7 initiations, for example, although she doesn't explain them much. So we can assume that evidently Master KH had some level, a fairly high level of initiation, but we know that during the course of this correspondence that he established with early theosophists, he went through another initiation in the middle of the correspondence. So what a complete adept means, we don't really know, but evidently he himself was in this process of continuing to grow. And, you know, the chances are that he may be a complete adept now. And so this was his state at the time. We don't know.
Well, that makes sense, because once a being thinks that they have attained all there is to attain, they'll stop learning.
Mm-hmm.
And learning is forever, as far as I understand the Secret Doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you for that, Judy. Next, let's go to Jeff. Jeff, are you there, hailing from Japan?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Pablo. And thanks. This is really inspiring and delightful. And thanks for the wonderful Theosophy Wiki that you do. The site is, I'm constantly using it. My coworkers are using it. So you're contributing to our movement all around the world. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking of what you had to say about, well, there's a lot of things. And one is, you know, you don't, okay, in that quote from Judge is saying that,
He froze.
Oh, I think we got him frozen for a moment.
Speaking from the silence.
That's great.
Tell him to turn his camera off.
Yes, Jeff, it might be better on your bandwidth to turn off the video.
All right. Now we can hear you again. You were saying that, Judge, you were about to
yeah. Okay. I'll if you can't hear me, then please let me know again. that Judge says that the mind in that higher state is no longer an organ, but a state of being. But also the mind is an organ, you worked on that wiki site. You got a lot of work done. You're using your mind as an organ in that case. And one thing on this is I think that meditation, from my observation, and this is a recent experience too that I had, somebody who's done decades of meditation and yet is still selfish. I mean, selfish, really self-centered, and I'm wondering about that, the relationship between what I'd say, the double spiral of inner work and outer work, and how to create a balance between those two.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean the first part of your comment, in the theosophical tradition, we say that whenever there is consciousness, there is matter. So whenever there is mind, there will be an organ to express that mind. But I think what Judge is referring to is the experience in meditation, that what we are trying to seek is not to realize a form or a body, but we are trying to realize that higher consciousness as a state of being. Now, this is my personal opinion, what I'm going to say, and of course I can be wrong and it may be controversial in some ways, but I think that most of the meditation, the practice of meditation, the modern practice of meditation that people engage in is not necessarily conducive to a spiritual realization. It may be good to help people release stress. It may be good to increase the power of the mind to focus, to think, etc. But most of the techniques of meditation, it can be good even to develop psychic powers, But most of the techniques of meditation that are out there are not really aiming at the higher consciousness. Blavatsky was the first person in the West to teach about meditation, aside from the contemplative practices of the Christian mystics and Jewish mystics, etc. But meditation, as we understand it today, was started by Blavatsky, especially she started teaching this in private to the inner group that I mentioned. And then later theosophists developed more that subject. But if we pay attention, Blavatsky says in a quote, she talks about the useless and tedious practice of counting the inhalations and exhalations as a means to produce, she says, absolute tranquility. So she says that practice of watching the breath is tedious and useless if you are trying to produce absolute tranquility. And of course, the practice of watching our breath can be very helpful in many ways. But if you see the techniques that Blavatsky recommended, they all involve a very creative and intelligent activity in the meditator trying to realize the higher nature. There is no mechanical technique in theosophical literature. Of course, I'm more familiar in details with the literature that comes from the Adyar tradition. That is a tradition that I belong to. And, all the techniques that have been developed by later theosophies, none of them are mechanical techniques. And HPB, there are 3 or 4 techniques that she taught, and they all involve a very conscious and strenuous effort to raise our consciousness. So in summary, what I mean is that meditation can produce a spiritual transformation only when that meditation is really an effort to realize our higher nature. The other meditations, they may or may not produce spiritual enlightenment, let's say. I suppose it depends on the maturity and the depth of the practitioner. But we know that most of those meditations are also used by black magicians, and they are the opposite of spiritual. But no black magician would use a meditation trying to realize the higher self. So when somebody says that he or she is meditating, that doesn't mean anything to me in particular. And it's quite, the same applies to study. We know we theosophists like to study, and many of us can be very selfish. So we need to, in our study, our meditation, we need to make an effort to realize the higher nature. Otherwise, it's not necessarily spiritual.
Pablo, can I follow up though? The effort to realize our spiritual nature also has a motivation. Mm-hmm. And the Maha Chohan touches on this in his letter when he says that the Theravada Buddhists are sort of have the highest form of selfishness. I mean, the most spiritual kind of selfishness. So I'm wondering what attitude toward that effort to realize your inner higher nature is what's beneficial, do you think?
Yes, evidently, if we are going to try to realize a state of consciousness where the personal I-ness is not, we cannot engage in that with the motivation that belongs to the personal I-ness, because that activity of the mind, the motivation is an activity of the mind. So in all our practice, if that motivation is present, that means that as long as that motivation is present, we will be limited to the personal consciousness. So this is also a very important aspect. I have written about this. There are several things, several problems from my point of view with modern meditation. If we think of meditation as a really spiritual activity, and the motivation is one of them, unless we are clear that personal motivation will not allow us to realize our higher nature, unless we are clear, then we will be operating with something that is a dead weight that will be a limitation. So this is why in the theosophical tradition there is so much about service for humanity. Our only motivation in this should be so that we can become co-workers of nature, as the voice of the silence says it, or that we can become co-workers of the masters in their effort to benefit humanity. I cannot help humanity if I'm under the same limitations as the rest of humanity. I mean, of course, we can help on a more superficial level, and that is great, but we cannot help in a radical way as long as we are part of the problem. So we need to realize our higher nature, not to gain personal enlightenment or anything like that, but because only then we can help humanity. And I think that's the only motivation, that belonging to the higher nature is not an obstacle.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for that clarification. Next, let's go to two of our San Diego Lodge folks. One is Desiree, and then next, Jonathan.
Hello.
Hello, Desiree.
Hi, Pablo. Real treat. Thank you so much. It's a special treat for me because I get to hear you give a presentation in real time. So thank you for that. It's a wonderful, comprehensive, and clear delineation of consciousness. I just had a quick observation too, because when you mentioned HPB's trying to give a description of consciousness on these higher levels and referencing it is consciousness of unconsciousness or unconsciousness of consciousness.
It's a conscious non-consciousness.
Conscious non-consciousness. It made me think.
Conscious is the adjective, not consciousness. So what is there is non-consciousness, but that doesn't mean that is unconscious. That's why she said conscious non-consciousness.
Non-consciousness. When you said that, it made me think of another concept that she basically asks us to meditate on, and that is to try to see the voidness of the seeming full and the fullness of the seeming void. And those things I think that kind of gives the same type of challenge, I guess, to the mind to expand it in ways that we might not have thought of before. Also, I wondered how important, especially after Jeff's observations, I was wondering, since this silence is so important in terms of being reunited with that familiar self that never goes away, that's with us from day one, and unchanging. Somehow, I think in meditation, oftentimes people start talking internally, and it's this talking that gets us further and further away from that truer self. But children who haven't learned syntax and language and all that, when we think about it, they wake up in the morning, they're conscious, but there's not a lot of chit chat going on in their minds. So we have to wonder whether or not we're just trying to be children again, in a way, to kind of remove all of those pre-expectations and the syntax, the language that's going on in our minds, and just sort of calm it down so that those limitations go away. Because there's no way that I can think about a personal ego if that language is completely gone, and I'm just left in silence.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah. Well, we know Jesus said you have to become like children in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. And normally in the theosophical view, evolution is always like that. It's a kind of U-shape. We start with a state that is close to the real, then we move away from it, and then we come back to a state that is similar to the initial one. But there is a key difference that in this journey away from and returning to the source, we gain something. That's why children are not enlightened, and a yogi can be enlightened, or a Mahatma, or whatever we say, because in that journey, there is a childlike attitude, but with profound wisdom and compassion and perception of the real. So yes, silence is essential in meditation. Of course, we have the voice of the silence, where Blavatsky talks about passing through different experiences until one is aware of the soundless sound. Another paradox, they are similar to conscious non-consciousness. However, we have to be careful. This, again, I think is one of the problems of modern meditation. The sense that meditation is silence is dangerous if not understood properly. Actually, Blavatsky said that those who were practicing meditation following, for example, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras that were barely available at the time, or those who sit for yoga, she said, unless they know what the esoteric teaching is, they are in danger of developing a mediumistic attitude, like a medium. So if we go into a practice of meditation and we just try to clear the mind, what we are doing is generating an empty space there that begins to be impressionable by the influences that are around us, the physical and astral and lower mental influences, because our seat of consciousness is normally in the lower mind, the emotions, and the body. And eventually, if that's how the mediums, the spiritualists, used to develop their mediumship, they would just sit, empty their minds, put themselves in a very passive state, and then let influences to come through them. So what we need to do is first to raise our consciousness to the higher nature by means of a strong use of our psyche, whether our mind or our emotions, like devotion. There is the devotional path of bhakti, which there is a lecture that is coming up, as we saw at the beginning. So in that way, the mind and the emotions are used to lead the devotee to the higher planes by means of stimulating the higher emotions. Or we can do it through the mind, as we saw in this diagram and in other methods that Blavatsky recommends. And only after we raise the seat of our consciousness to the highest that we can, then we enter in a state of silence where we begin to be, we can be influenced by the higher nature and not the lower nature. There is a letter from Master KH that was circulated among the members of the esoteric section at the time, where the master is saying here, we do need to get to a state of blankness, but a state in which we are resistant to the lower influences and receptive to the higher influences of the higher self or the master. So in the theosophical tradition, the idea is that you aim to get to a state of deep silence only after you have done your work with your mind and emotions. If you think that meditation is sitting and clearing your mind, then that can produce actually bad results. I think next month in the Theosophist, they are publishing an article on meditation because this is quite complex and there are several things to keep in mind. They are publishing an article on meditation that I just submitted. You can find the Theosophist for free online. That will be next month if somebody is interested in looking at all of this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, for that explanation and distinction about different types of meditation. Let's go to Jonathan and then see if we have time.
Is it okay, Monica? Or?
Oh, no, you
Okay.
go. You go.
I've already. Do you want to hit that other button, the number 2 button on the front? There.
Yeah.
Do you see me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Oh, I'm thinking of a couple of more than one slide. One of them was that Subba Rao and Master KH both spoke of initiations. And that was kind of part of the dynamic of what they were trying to expound. And that the path apparently isn't just floating up like there's helium and you just kind of somehow go, but it's punctuated by these events, these occurrences. And that's very interesting. And oh wow. Okay. And then there was another thing that you had another slide where you're talking about, I think where you had logos, then you had rays, then you had Atman, but each person's Atman would, or a sense of I-ness at that level apparently, can travel up that ray. If traveling is an okay word. And so so I wanted to just see if you wouldn't mind exploring, at least theoretically, that these events, apparently there's not just one initiation, but there can be multiple or myriad or however to think about that. And that there's apparent, and also this idea of merging, because there's a merging. You use the word merging a few times, I think, in your presentation. And so that there's like these mergings that can happen in terms of the universalization of consciousness. It could even apply to this thing about the drop in the ocean too, I suppose. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that. And also there's, with initiation, there's beings involved, presumably, and that there's relationships involved. For example, the masters always, many times they spoke of their teachers and so forth in this, reverential way. But presumably these teachers or gurus or higher beings or whatever, these guides, have a wider basis of identity, a more universal basis of identity. And these initiations or mergings or whatever, would that be kind of, I was wondering if you could talk about that in relationship to this path of increasing universal consciousness.
Yes. I mean, unfortunately, during the first generation of theosophists, there wasn't much about this subject. Blavatsky does mention that there are 7 initiations. If you go to the wiki that Jeff mentioned, theosophy.wiki, and search for initiation, there are all the quotes that I found from HPV, which are not many, on the subject of initiation. As I said, we know that Master KH went through a process of initiation during the correspondence, where his body was kept in a kind of trance for a couple of months or so. Presumably this was a higher initiation. So yes, there seems to be like a first and a second and a third, initiations. But there is not much that was written in the first generation of theosophists. In the second generation, I know in the Point Loma tradition, the Puruker has written about that. In the Adyar tradition, Anipesa and Leadbeater wrote about that. And there are a lot of details about what happens. Normally, the idea is that there is some kind of meeting on the higher plane, some ceremony where the adepts are channeling certain forces to help the initiate have a certain realization, that because Subha Rao explains in the article Occultism in Southern India that the path of initiation is an artificial path. He says, by that I don't mean that it's unnatural. There is the possibility in nature of going through this more accelerated path by means of a series of initiations. It's what he says about the initiations is quite interesting. So you can refer to that article. And he says, in this, the adept is directing forces to the disciple that the moral or the spiritual evolution of the disciple has not really reached. So they are forcing something on the disciple so that the disciple can gain a perception of the higher planes faster than he could by his own means. And then the disciple, of course, has a lot of work to do to bring that vision that was given to him or her, to start bringing that into their personal consciousness. And Subha Rao says, because of this, the path of initiation is dangerous, because the person is put in touch with forces and developments and realizations that person is not really ready for, or would not be there naturally, and then things can go wrong. But if the disciple is able to go through this, then with these aids, that person can get to adeptship far faster than the person could by his own individual efforts. So that's basically what Subha Rao says. And the idea is that, yes, these initiations are meant for the adepts would only bring into the fold, into that path of initiation, only people who are pursuing this to help humanity. There is a letter where Master Moria says, there are thousands of sadhus and yogis living in the forest that lead a very pure and spiritual life, but being on the path of error, they never hear from us. What the path of error is not clear. The master doesn't say it, but because of the context of the letter, I think that what he's saying, these people are there for their own evolution. And they are very spiritual, very pure. But we let them pursue their own path because they are interested only in their own evolution. Now, those individuals that are interested in helping humanity, then those are the individuals that may be brought to the path of initiation. When they are ready, of course, there is a lot of work to be done before we can be exposed to all those forces if the initiation is not going to go wrong. So basically, I think that's all I could say without going into the second generation theosophies that you may or may not be interested in that point of view.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Pablo. Let me point out we're at the top of the hour to respect time for people who might have to leave, and anyone that's okay. And Pablo, if you have a few more moments, I want to look at some of the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we have something from Laura. She says, the thorough discussion on the sevenfold nature of man brought to life a greater meaning from the voice of the silence. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thankful thing
Well,
for that.
the voice of the silence is a lot about initiation too, since we were talking about that. The second fragment and even the third one. It's about initiation. So there we see some of the qualifications that are needed to get into the path of initiation. It's a great book.
Well, thank you. And then from Graham, we have another quote. Amazing lecture, exclamation. The 3-point exercise is hard work, especially the third one. That is, quote, parenthesis, the perception in all embodied beings of limitation only. That one is difficult, Graham says.
The whole diagram of meditation is quite challenging. Again, you can go in the wiki, theosophy.wiki. If you search for diagram of meditation, you will find there the diagram as it was originally published and articles and lectures on that. And the whole diagram of meditation is quite challenging because the goal is very lofty, realizing the higher nature. A spirituality that aims at realizing the spiritual nature is a spirituality that is demanding. And that's why modern spirituality tends to be more superficial, which is not bad, because before we can get to that more demanding spirituality, we need to go through those early stages. So I'm not against that at all. What is important is to keep in mind that, generally speaking, the modern spirituality as it is presented is preliminary. Don't expect that will lead you to the end. And even the theosophical approach is also preliminary from a certain point of view. Most of what is written, I think, this is my opinion, is to realize the higher ego. But then from there to the monad, then we will get instructions on the inner planes. So even theosophical teachings is for the next step that we have to take. So all steps are necessary, but don't be afraid of challenging exercises if you are seeking to realize your higher nature. Even in this, we need to approach them in an impersonal way. If you come to spirituality trying to feel empowered and trying to feel flattered and with a sense of accomplishment, all these things that belong to the lower ego, well, you will be disappointed in the theosophical tradition for the most part, especially if you go to the deeper aspects. This higher spirituality requires from the beginning that you are not led by personal expectations, personal ambition, personal search for results.
Well, thank you, Pablo. It reminds me of going from elementary school to college. You don't want a third grade math student to try to be doing calculus, but you still respect the third grade math student doing their work at that level. And then from Judy, we have another note in the chat. Thank you, she says. Thank you all for a most transforming session. Great exposition, Pablo.
Thank you. I see also that Janet and Larry, thank you. And they are friends of mine also.
Indeed. And we had one more question from the audience here in San Diego. If you have a few more moments, Pablo?
Yes.
Okay, all right. We have a question from Monica.
Well, thank you. First of all, just an amazing presentation. I truly appreciate it. you and Jonathan spoke a bit about what I'd like to ask. In one of your slides, you had the six rays and the Atma as the seventh. I'm thinking that that's what that represented. That the Atma is the totality of all. Is that am I correct in thinking that?
That diagram, maybe there are six and I miscounted, but the idea is that the rays are the seven rays. Our Atman emanates from one of those rays. Now, the Atman is complex also.
I see.
You know, Blavatsky sometimes would say Atman is a ray of the absolute, so it's the absolute reality within us. But then she would talk about Atman in the confinement of the monad, Atma Buddhi, as something more personal. I put there Atma because this is what Subarao was talking about. More technically speaking, what emanates through the seven rays is the monad, is Atma Buddhi. I mean, you can take Atman as being this universal principle, and Buddhi is the vehicle of a portion, although Atman cannot be divided, but it's the vehicle of Atman that will act as a monad for that soul and personality. So, technically speaking, you could put the monad there, but because all the quotes were talking about Atman, I didn't want to introduce more confusion. So, so in short, the seven rays are the seven primordial celestial beings. Sometimes Blavatsky would talk about the seven logoi, through which all our monads emanate. And the head of the ray that we belong to, Blavatsky would say, is our Father in heaven at the level of the monad. You know, sometimes you would talk about the Father in heaven of the personality is the monad, but for the monad, is the head of the particular ray that the monad emanated from. So that's what he's trying to do.
Thank you. If I could just ask, because the reason I was asking about the monad, or rather the Atma with the three rays on either side, was I know that in the Secret Doctrine, HPB speaks of this idea that every soul or human being is watched over or overarched, let's say, by a specific planet. And so I was wondering if, when you were talking about initiation, if the adept at certain levels has gone through that experience through every planet. Is that part of their development to the next level of initiation? And at some point, have they had the experience being directed by each of those rays, each of those planets in that way?
Yeah. So yes, the planets are the physical embodiments of these seven primordial celestial beings.
Okay.
Blavatsky mentions what you say in the Secret Doctrine, and then she explains this further in the esoteric instructions. So in the esoteric instructions, there is quite a bit of complex teachings on this, but what she says is that each ray has within itself the seven rays as sub-rays. So that when an adept realizes its true nature, it does it through the particular ray that he or she emanated from. But because each ray has the seven sub-rays within, all adepts have the quality of all the rays, but overshadowed or tinted, let's say, by the color of the ray that belongs to them. So it's like, if you put, I don't know, green glasses, you can see the seven colors on a paper, but they are all going to be kind of greenish. And a person that has yellow glasses will see the seven colors, but kind of yellowish. that's more or less what she presents in the esoteric instructions. Now, the first generation of theosophies didn't talk about the rays connected to initiations. In the Adyar tradition, later on, yes, the idea is that a person is initiated under the influence of an adept that belongs to your same ray. But again, that's more, the second generation theosophies.
Thank you so very much.
Yes, and thank you, Pablo, for sharing with us your knowledge and your wisdom and experience here in this study group, this little virtual Sangha. So this student in particular is very grateful as well.
Yeah, thank you all. I'm very happy to have the opportunity, and I enjoy getting to share some of these ideas with you and listening to your thoughts too.
Thank you, Pablo, for doing this.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Namaste.
Namaste. Goodbye, all.
Thanks
Thanks,
for saying
Pablo. Arigato.
it. Take care.
Arigato.